I'm glad the moderator did not ask me about the age, but I can reveal the secret. I'm 71, if someone is interested. Among many threats to the world peace today, it is the war in Ukraine which is the greatest. It appears to be a conflict between democracy and authoritarianism. The fundamental aspect of the war in Ukraine is legal in essence. We are in the presence of an invasion of a sovereign state by an aggressor that violated the United Nations Charter. The latter is to be held accountable, responsible, if you wish, in terms of international law. We should, however, bear in mind, and we have already heard that the aggressor, Russia, is a country which is a nuclear power and a permanent member of the UN Security Council. Within the system of the United Nations, everyone is expected to side with the invaded country, which more than 140 UN member states did by adopting a resolution which condemned the aggression in the UN General Assembly. Many of those countries also introduced economic sanctions on the aggressor in order to hamper its war efforts. However, despite the huge solidarity and siding with the victim of the aggression in order to support its defense of the national territory, there are other circumstances which are by no means negligible. Namely, the country under attack, Ukraine, while bravely defending its national territory, gets heavily ravaged as the war goes on, which is the fact that makes us turn to the other aspect of the crisis, which may be labeled as practical. The practical aspect of the crisis consists in the diplomatic approach to the problem of putting an end to the fratricide war in Ukraine and restoring peace between neighbors who indeed have very much in common. At the end of the day, restoring peace in Ukraine will be an outcome of diplomatic efforts, which must find their place within the framework of international law. Regretfully, there have so far been few initiatives to solve the problem. One of the rare coherent proposals has been known under the name of the Italian Peace Plan. It consists of 4 points. A, introducing ceasefire and demilitarization on the front line. This poses a problem insofar as it tends to draw a line between the two confronted armies, which would be somewhere on the Ukrainian territory, because the invading troops are at the moment on the Ukrainian soil. Therefore, it threatens to freeze the situation existing at the battlefield. B, neutrality of Ukraine under international guarantees. It has been suggested that a group of nations, including some extra-European, should appear as guarantors of the country's neutrality status. This raises the question of efficiency of the future Ukrainian neutrality guarantees. C, a bilateral agreement between Ukraine and Russia on the status of the Crimean Peninsula and the region of Donbass. It should be accompanied by an agreement on cultural and language rights, as well as on guarantees for the free circulation of people, goods, and capital. Concluding such bilateral agreements between Ukraine and Russia is at the moment hardly imaginable. A constitutional lawyer is tempted to add a small footnote here, insisting on the introducing of a power-sharing agreement in Ukraine as the basis of its future constitutional settlement. The Minsk Agreement of 2014, concluding under the OSCE auspices, which provided for decentralization of power in Ukraine, had been abandoned by the Ukrainian government before the war broke out. The decentralization and power sharing, nevertheless, seem to be the only tools susceptible to preserve the unity of the country and the entirety of its national territory under the Ukrainian sovereignty. And finally, D, concluding a peace treaty between the European Union and Russia, which would encompass provisions on the removal of Russian troops from Ukraine in exchange for the lifting of sanctions against Russia. The fourth point of the peace plan overcomes the strictly bilateral character of points A and C and goes in parallel to some extent with the point B because of its multilateral approach to the issue of restoration of peace. Notably, there has been no mention of the NATO, which would have probably better suited the main idea standing behind this point. The intentions of the plan drafters remain unclear. They may have wished to avoid the direct NATO involvement. The provision is linked to the sanctions imposed on Russia by the EU, but it presupposes somehow that other nations like the US, UK, Canada, or Japan would follow the Europeans at this point. The analysis of the Italian peace plan brings us to further considerations. Long-lasting consequences of the war in Ukraine will come about, especially in Europe. On the one hand, there will be new NATO members, possibly also new EU members, and last but not least, the EU common defense may eventually be launched. On the other hand, Russia left the Council of Europe, refused to abide by the Convention for the Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms, and her return to the pan-European family of nations is not likely to occur in the foreseeable future. These are parts of the overarching repercussions of the current crisis. The political and economic evolution in Europe as the aftermath of the Ukrainian war will face challenges. Topics like the return of refugees or the reconstruction of Ukrainian economy or some new arrangements of trade will first be treated, but the problems will not remain exclusively European. The most significant outcome of the Ukrainian war consists in the fact that the world order will be subject to substantial changes. Although it may take some time to put the general issue of the new international order on the diplomatic agenda, we might be closer to that moment than we imagine today. Once the global security, that is, the questions concerning the world order, start being negotiated, the actors on the international scene will have to face transformations of the political environment. We have already been warned on their emergence by Henry Kissinger, who in his book published 8 years ago made a remark on the balance of power system, stating that regions beyond Europe will play a major role in defining the attributes of the world order. Considering in the concluding parts of the book, The World Order in Our Time, Kissinger made another important remark, enumerating what he labeled as the lacking dimensions of the world structure. He found among those, and I quote, the absence of an effective mechanism to consult and possibly cooperate on most consequential issues, unquote. Notably, among the insufficient mechanisms, the author mentioned the UN Security Council because of the possibility of blockade within that body, along with more recently organized fora like G7 or G20. This has been done despite the difference of status of the latter fora if compared to the organ of the world's most outstanding international organization. The world will have to reconsider its organization and political structure so as to be able to cope with various challenges, not necessarily the preservation of peace. We must not forget the climate changes or migrations or health and food issues and the like. New approaches to the problems should be introduced. The international law needs a renewal. A quick look on the Ukrainian war may put a question mark on the traditional patterns of approach to problems. Although the conflict appears, at first sight, to have confronted democracy to authoritarianism, it may not be fully regarded as such. Some important democracies of the world, like India, Mexico, Brazil, South Africa, and Indonesia, have decided not to participate in imposing sanctions on the aggressor. Democracies will have to negotiate with the authoritarian regimes. trying to make the latter adopt certain measures aimed at lessening of the pressure upon their citizens. But this is a pattern that has already been implemented during the Cold War. It is therefore legitimate to raise questions like, is the world facing a new Cold War? And will there be a remake of the containment policy? Let us mention here that the author of the containment policy, George Kennan, the #2 of the US Embassy in Moscow, who promoted it in the famous long telegram dated 22nd of February 1946, altered his opinion in the 1990s. At that time, he advocated the integration policy instead, tending to enhance contacts between Russia and the West in order to make the former adopt certain essential values of the latter. Visiting or revisiting elements of the global political and legal framework shows the complexity of the international relations at the planetary level. They call for thorough reflections, sincere commitments, tactful responses to sensitive questions, and last but not least, for the mutual understanding of global actors. At this point, one is tempted to quote Henry Kissinger once again. In his most recent volume, he briefly tackled the cause of the war in Ukraine, and I quote, "The February 2022 invasion of Ukraine, in flagrant violation of international law, is largely an outgrowth of a failed strategic dialogue, or else of an inadequately undertaken one." End of quotation. The dialogue is clearly the only tool that can get us out of trouble. Both elements of the path to the solution of the problem of war in Ukraine are present in Kissinger's words. Law and diplomacy play the outstanding role in the construction of the world order. They might be in discrepancy from time to time, but in the long run, they inevitably operate together. At the very end, let a poet show us the way how to proceed, concluding this intervention by Paul Fort's verse from his famous La Ronde, which celebrates the world friendship. Alors on pourrait faire une ronde autour du monde si tous les gens du monde voulaient se donner la main. We could make it around the world if all people of the world wanted to reach out to one another. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now I'm going to collect questions again. I'm seeing my first question too. Okay, so we're going to start with you.
Good noon, everyone. I was expecting to hear something, at least a single word about Afghanistan. By the way, I'm Atfaqiyan from Afghanistan, but it seems no one cares about what's happening now in Afghanistan. Since you are a human rights defender, what's your sketch for Afghan people who don't have access? Sorry, you're covering space. Okay, since you're a human rights defender, so what's your sketch for Afghan people? Those don't have access, at least for their fundamental rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to make a little note. There is at least 10 active wars. So yes, we can talk about Afghanistan, but we also haven't talked about Mali and like multiple African countries and so on. That's always a problem in a world with so many conflicts. Mm-hmm. So the speaker had to concentrate on something. Michael?
Thank you very much for the speech. Thank you very much. While some countries tend to be foes, others tend to be allies. And of course, sometimes the threats thereof depend on which side that you decide to choose. My question here is, how do nations first, as individual states, and then as members of these regional bodies, navigate through the dilemma of choosing which side? Of course, bearing in mind the consequences of their actions and the nations and, towards global peace and security. So more like, how do we protect the oppressed against the oppressor? Thank you.
Okay, next to me.
Thank you. I'm Riccardo Finozzi from the Central Bank of Italy. I would like to ask you what your opinion is on the role of propaganda in this war, not just on the Russian side, but also on the Ukrainian side, because the narratives that have been going on have been dividing a lot the public opinion in European countries. And this is affecting also elections within European democracies. So I think this is a really, pressing issue. Thank you very much.
So now I would let you answer, and if you give a quick, precise answer, we can even do a second round.
Thank you. You can interrupt me if you wish. To the question coming from Afghanistan, that is a very complex question. You need negotiations in Afghanistan, but the trouble is that the current government probably refuses to negotiate with anyone. Time will be the judge, because in the long run, the Taliban government will remain relatively isolated, not totally. And then if they start facing economic troubles, they will need support from the outside. That is also the dilemma of the containment policy. Do we apply the containment policy on Afghanistan? I would say that would be dangerous. That would be even worse than letting Afghanistan come into the sphere of the influence of Iran or some other countries, whatever. Therefore, it is difficult. I cannot provide a proper answer, but these are my thoughts on the issue. We can discuss later if you wish. A nation choosing sides, the question from Ghana, it's an excellent one, if I may comment, because all the nations of the world, like Serbia, where I come from, or Armenia, or any country, would like to be independent, to choose sides in any conflict. But we need some realism. We are not, those who are involved in politics, they know, we are not making politics on the moon. We must be realistic. You have neighbors, you have the world situation as it is. Let me give you an example coming from the time of World War I. It was during World War I that the government of this country, of Germany, approached the government of Mexico, suggesting that Mexico could attack the US with a view to regain territories that had been lost in the 19th century. The Mexican government refused because they were realistic. There are other examples of that kind. If you wish, I can quote them. And then propaganda, the question coming from Italy. Well, yes, there is a lot of propaganda on both sides, but we all have our choices. For instance, I side with the Ukrainians, and I do not feel the propaganda coming from that side, but I feel the propaganda coming from the Russian side, and vice versa. Yes, it is a problem, and well, the freedom of the press should play its role, but now the freedom of the press has been hampered. Recently, it was, I think, this morning that I've read in the press that the new Russian-controlled station in France, RT France, was refused the right to broadcast because it was controlled by the Russians. But for instance, in Serbia, there is Sputnik in Serbian. I wouldn't advise you to listen to that, because I once heard that in a taxi, because the taxi driver turned it on, and they do not call the Ukrainian government. They say, they use the expression the Kiev regime and the troops of the Kiev regime, etc., etc. I don't know what to say and how to respond to your question. The propaganda exists and it will continue existing. The remedy for the bitter propaganda is the freedom of the press in the long run and in the last resort.
So we have time for one more question, but it has to be brief. Okay, so there's second places. Okay, I'm gonna leave the question to you. Lynch me later outside maybe for that.
Thank you, Mr. Popovic, for your excellent and eloquent speech. And you have covered the history of the war. My name is Musharraf Hussain Bhuiya. I am the ambassador of Bangladesh. You have covered most of the issues relating to the war. And my contention is most of the countries of the world, except the allies of the Soviet Russia, are blaming Russia for their invasion and aggression. The United States is, mobilizing strength from Europe to condemn, and at the same time, they are helping Ukraine. And many of the influential heads of the states and heads of the government have visited Ukraine to render their support. I understand that because of the sanctions proposed by the US, most of the countries of the world have been suffering. The supply chain has been disrupted, prices are rising, and many countries are going to be bankrupt because of this situation, world situation. So there should be efforts to persuade Russia to stop the war. And there should be some negotiators, mediators for convincing Russia, but we see this type of actions more or less absent. Only Macron of France and Olaf Scholz of Germany talked over telephone 2-3 times maybe, but nobody went to Kremlin to talk to Putin or proposed any tripartite or dialogue for this. Only everybody is blaming, but this blame game will not solve the problem. What is your views?
There was another question.
Okay, I guess there was more of a comment than a question, but since we have time constraints, I would leave the floor to you and also to have like a closing remark, if you want to.
It's in the fourth point of the Italian peace plan. That's the idea, the philosophy of ending the war in exchange of the leaving sanctions against the withdrawal of troops. That is not very realistic, much to my regret. As for the sanctions, you're right, many countries which do not have anything to do with this conflict suffer, but that is inevitable. That is the chain of consequences. And then, as for the sanctions also, the idea of the West is first to make harder the war efforts of the Russian government, and second, to suppress Russia in the sense that the Russian population could face such an amount of troubles that the Russian government would have to cede. There is a footnote to that, which is not precise in this calculation, is the fact, much to my regret, that the Russian population can suffer much more than the Western politicians can imagine. But in the long run, the Russians cannot compete with the Western technology. So we'll see. We'll see. The future will tell. The sanctions, Russia will somehow live with the sanctions because that poor nation that has lived under the authoritarian regimes ever since the beginning of the 20th century, if you wish, has the population which is used to suffering. And the Russians count adversely that there will be problems in the West at the level of civic protests, etc., if there would be no fuel, no oil, gas, etc. That does not seem very likely. There will be solidarity in the West, and the Western governments will manage somehow. But I cannot properly answer your questions, and I agree with you that there should be mediators. Who are going to be the mediators? China? India? Perhaps. The United Nations cannot do that, but, well, I'll stop here. Thank you.